Hi everyone, what you're about to watch is an interview I conducted earlier this week on the subject of Universal Basic Income, UBI, with the writer and UBI advocate Scott Santens. Andrew Yang has before described Scott Santens as the leading thinker on Universal Basic Income and said that he has learned so much from him. According to Yang, he was also one of the first people he sat down with when he was considering running for President of the United States. I hope you enjoy the interview, and if you do, please do subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Here it is. Scott, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to me today. So why don't we start here? Why don't you tell me how you got interested in universal basic income as a topic? Because you've obviously done extensive research on it.
Yeah. I first got interested back in 2013, and back then it was before actually anyone was really talking about the future of work, the effects of automation, these kinds of things. The Oxford report hadn't come out yet, and a discussion hit the front page of Reddit about how quickly technology was advancing and how nobody was talking about it. And I just thought that the entire discussion thread was fascinating because here I thought I'd been following technology, and a lot of the stuff was new to me too. And one of the recommendations in that thread was to read this book called Manna by Marshall Brain, and it's a short science fiction novella about basically the kind of beginnings of like heavy automation in society. And I just found that fascinating, and how it painted this picture of like this divergent kind of future where things were either going to get a lot worse for most people, or we could utilize that technology to actually make things a lot better for everybody. And that seemed pretty clear that was the way to go, was to make things better. And the author was for a this idea called a universal basic income. So I started looking into it, and I was just fascinated to learn about these experiments that we did into a guaranteed income back in the 70s in both the U.S. and Canada. I had no idea that Nixon had proposed a guaranteed income in 1969, and these experiments were part of that. It had passed the House in 70 and 71. And it just didn't pass through the Senate. Like all of this, it was just fascinating to learn and to dive into the evidence behind all of this, to dive into the evidence that was not only part of those experiments in the 70s, but also more recent experiments now. And it just seemed that all the evidence was pointing in the same direction. And after I also kind of spent some time looking into the philosophy behind it, it just seemed like, this is not only something that works, but it's something that we really should do. And once I reached the conclusion that if we did this one thing, we really could change a lot of things for the better, then I decided to focus on this. And so, yeah, here I am now. And along the way too, I crowdfunded my own basic income in 2016, and have been living with that, so I can actually, have a sense of what it's like to feel that economic security that I want other people to feel as well, and how much of a difference it makes in enabling, me to pursue the work that I feel is most important.
You crowdfunded your own basic income. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I utilized the platform Patreon. And for those who don't know, Patreon is like a Kickstarter for creatives. And so there's a lot of like YouTubers will use Patreon, vloggers and bloggers and artists and all sorts of creative people can be funded. Their work can be funded directly by those who most appreciate the work that they're doing and want to support that work. And this is, it's a monthly perpetual crowdfunding. So it's not like you just crowdfund once and then that's it. It's a monthly thing. So because of that, I can count on that income every month. I know what that is going to be, and that just enables me to focus on this full time.
And when you say you're in favor of universal basic income, which you are, um, What version of it are you in favor of? So obviously Andrew Yang's proposal in his presidential campaign was to give every U.S. citizen over the age of 18 $1,000 a month, which he said could be paid for through, among other things, a value-added tax of 10%, a financial transaction tax, a carbon fee. Is your version of universal basic income that you see as an ideal identical to his, or both in terms of what it looks like and how it would be paid for?
Well, I helped with that plan even, and I approve of it, and there's a lot of ways of going about it, and so let's just cover quickly what like the definition of basic income is, what is considered to be a basic income. And so you need the major elements are that it needs to be unconditional. So you get it whether you're working or not working, and it's fully universal. It goes to everyone, rich or poor, and it's individual, so it goes to each person and not like targeted to the household. And this is also a regularly provided income. So it needs to be on a monthly, weekly, biweekly kind of basis. And so if you meet those requirements, then you got yourselves a basic income. And Yang's met those requirements. You could argue, as some people would, that when it comes to universality, that it's fully universal if it reaches all adults. And for me personally, I think it also should reach kids. So then for the plan that I support, I prefer to have an amount that goes to adults and kids. And there's also, say, a lot of countries, let's say if Canada decided to introduce a basic income, then they essentially already have one for kids. So it would make sense to just do it for adults. But that's one of those arguments that there are as far as how do you define universal? Is it citizens? Is it legal residents? That kind of thing as well. But I thought Andrew Yang's proposal was a solid universal basic income proposal, and I do believe as well that a 10% VAT makes a lot of sense to help fund it in the U.S. because we don't have a VAT yet, and it's a successful tax that is in most OECD countries, and it would function well to actually get that revenue that is currently not being raised through companies like Amazon who are not paying federal taxes here in the U.S.
You mentioned the VAT there. A counterpoint, which I'm sure you've heard before, is won't this get passed on to consumers by businesses and in effect cancel out the benefits you say a universal basic income will have?
Yeah, you can look at it as it can cancel it out, but only at a certain threshold point, and I think that's an important understanding, because first of all, when we're talking universal basic income, it's not that in most proposals, it's not that you're just dropping new money onto everybody, and then the question becomes like, where does it come from? Well, it's like invented money in order for it to go to everybody. The way that it really works for most designed plans is that you're circulating money from the top to the bottom and middle. So it involves a net transfer. And so in any UBI plan, you're going to have someone who's, say, paying, say, $12,000 to receive $12,000. And so their net benefit is zero. And then if you're earning over that amount, then you're effectively, again, your net benefit is zero. And that money that you're paying over that is going to fund those who are net recipients below that threshold. And so when it comes to, say, like a 10% VAT, let's assume that we're talking Yang's plan, so it's $1,000 per month, and let's also assume that the full amount is actually passed on to the buyer, and it's across like everything, which is not the case in reality. But for sake of simplicity, let's assume that. So if you are earning, or if you are spending $120,000 per year and receiving $12,000, then 10% of your 120,000 being spent is going to the VAT. So you're paying for your own basic income through your spending of $120,000 per year. In which case, everyone spending more than $120,000 per year is a net payer into the system, and everyone receiving or spending less than $120,000 a year is a net recipient. So, of course, if you're spending, $1,000 per month because that's all that you have, then you're spending $100 per month on the VAT, and you're a net recipient of $900 per month. So even in that example, you can see that even though someone is paying for the VAT out of what they're receiving through the freedom dividend, then they are still a net beneficiary of 90% of their total.
And Scott, just to be clear, I should have asked this before. Are you only in favor of or only focused on UBI being adopted in the US, or would you like to see some form or forms of it adopted in other countries as well?
Well, I'm in support of it in every country around the world. And I think that the first country to actually adopt basic income will actually, set off the domino kind of effect of other countries saying, oh, well, like that works really well. That helped their economic growth, that reduced the what they were spending on poverty, which is extremely expensive, and it'll make, I think, countries more competitive in our globalized economy, and I think other countries will follow suit after whoever the first country is to adopt it.
And earlier you talked about you looking into the philosophy behind basic income. What do you mean by that, and what did you find?
Yeah, I think that that Thomas Paine himself had a very strong argument, and this was over 200 years ago in the U.S. And Thomas Paine's argument was essentially that humanity has essentially been robbed of their natural inheritance. We created a private property system, and we didn't compensate people for what was taken from them. And so, just a kind of like an example of that, it's like when let's say you take some metal from the earth and you create something out of it. Let's say you create just like a mechanical device of some kind. The metal is all from the earth itself, and we absolutely transform that, and you can make a computer out of it. And so obviously you create added value to it. But now those resources that anyone else on Earth, could have used is gone, and they didn't get compensated for that. And, who do you have the right to just take the resources from the Earth and use it for yourself? So his argument was that, look, we do want to add value to things, but we should see that the actual Earth itself that nobody created is effectively owned by everyone on Earth. And so when you use the resource, then you should effectively pay in to a pool, that rewards everyone, on Earth. And in the U.S., the closest thing to a basic income has existed in Alaska since 1982, and that's effectively what they're doing. They have this great oil wealth in Alaska that they found in the late 70s, and they decided that, look, this wealth should belong to all of Alaska. This is natural oil wealth. It shouldn't just accrue to the people who are drilling it out of the ground. It should actually benefit everyone as a recognition of their rightful share of that natural resource. I also like Paine's argument that civilization is great. There's a lot of benefits from it, but also we created a kind of poverty that did not exist prior to that. So, prior to the creation of civilization, let's say you could spend a few hours foraging for nuts and berries or hunting or whatever, and that's a few hours of your own work that you could do, and there was no price on existence, and we created that. Like we created a price on existence, and we essentially roped off the earth and said, no, look, if you want access to these resources, then you have to work for me in order to, get this access to it. And so if we create a situation where people are actually worse off in a state of civilization than they were prior to the state of civilization, then that's wrong. We should actually make sure that nobody is worse off now than they were prior, in which case that requires compensation for everybody. And Thomas Paine's plan was to actually make sure that everyone got this starting capital upon reaching the age of 21. And I think that, he wasn't talking about a fully universal basic income, but his logic behind it is, I still think, very sound to this day.
And automation is a big linchpin in your argument, isn't it? So could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So automation should benefit all of us. The entire purpose of automation is to allow us to do more with less. And if you look at how productive we are in the U.S. compared to the 1970s, we're over twice as productive as we were back then. And so what does that mean for us? It doesn't mean that we're all working half as much and still consuming just as much. No, it's not the case. Are we all consuming twice as much because we're twice as productive? No. Actually, productivity entirely decoupled from our earnings back then. And so all this growth and all this, everything the technology is enabling us to do has been flowing up to, the very top, say 10% of earners, and mostly the top 1%. And everyone else is not being better off through this technological advancement. And that's a big problem to look at. That this conversation tends to be what's going to happen in the future, and like this need for basic income as people lose their jobs. But the fact is that we've already been seeing this. Like this has been like a slow motion kind of thing where people have been losing their jobs and the technology has been transforming the labor market. But it's just been over a course of decades. And the result of this has actually been pushing down on wages. It's been stagnant wages. It's been a shift from people working kind of middle skill kind of jobs to more low skill jobs. So we've been coring out the middle class because that's where it made the most sense to automate first. Because if you're someone and you're earning $60,000 a year, then a robot only has to be cheap enough to replace that many people at $60,000 a year to make that investment worth it. Whereas it's a lot harder to say replace a fast food worker if they're working a minimum wage job because they're barely earning enough money, and so the machine has to be even cheaper than that in order to invest in that technology. So one of the problems is that human labor is so cheap. It's artificially cheap because we're all competing against each other to get these jobs that are remaining after the jobs have been automated in the middle of the spectrum. So this problem has already existed. It's been getting worse, and it will only continue to get worse. And it's funny too, when I say it's getting worse, it shouldn't be that way. Like we should be looking at like, oh my gosh, we can automate this stuff. That's great. And this should be a good thing that we can automate all these things. But it's not working out that way because we haven't instituted a system that actually makes sure that automation lifts everybody up.
But let's say a universal basic income is introduced as a solution. Presumably, having heard you speak about this before, you think it would involve us reorienting our perception of our work, of our relationship to work, I should say.
Yeah. Certainly, part of it is a kind of a reanalysis of work and kind of the point of it all. When I say that my basic income enables me to do the work that I wish to pursue, it's recognizing that you need income you need access to resources in order to actually do work. You can't just expect people to do things without anything. And so that's part of the problem that the basic income helps fix. And another thing too is that so many people are doing work without any earnings from it. It's entirely unpaid work. It's volunteering. It's unpaid care work at home. There are so many forms of work that we don't consider to be work because it's not paid. And so I think that's that connection we need to break out from too, is to recognize that so much work that's valuable in society is not recognized through monetary compensation, and that it actually is beneficial to everybody. So we even want more of that. Like, we want to enable people to do unpaid work, especially when it's important. We're in a really weird situation where we can have, say, you can imagine two parents, and they both get paid during the day to watch each other's kid. So they both drive to and from each other's houses, and they both get paid, say, $30,000 per year in order to do this childcare. And so the GDP recognizes this as a total of $60,000, and taxes tax that, and people recognize as, oh wow, these care workers are doing great work. And then if they just watch their own kid and raise their own kids, then we would consider that as not being work, and GDP would see $0 because they're not earning anything, and taxes would not, governments would not see that as being like beneficial to them. So that's part of the problem, is that we are not seeing work as valuable work that is valuable work, and it actually is very beneficial to other people. So it's funny, if you were to, let's say, if every unpaid worker were to go on strike and just stop doing the work, then obviously you would have to pay more in order to get people to do that work, in which case it would cost the rest of us a lot more money in order to get people to do that work. So we're being subsidized by people who are doing unpaid work. And so basic income also recognizes that, saying, look, you are doing valuable work, and we want to both recognize and enable more of that.
So I think it will be useful, actually, in this interview for me to put some common criticisms of universal basic income that I've heard to you and get your response to them. So the first point of view I've heard that's used to criticize UBI goes something like this. Scott, I think it's a great idea for me personally. I'd use it to save, to pay off debts, to set up my own business, but I just don't think my fellow citizen would use it wisely. I think many of them would squander the money on things like drugs and alcohol. Your response?
Yeah, no, it's funny how common that belief is. It's one of those things where if you walk into a room and let's say there's 100 people there, and you were to ask them, raise your hand if you would continue working, and if you received a basic income, and like everyone will raise their hand. And if you were to ask them, if other people would stop working, then they'd all raise their hand too. It's like we all think these weird things about each other, and that's like we think that we ourselves are somehow special, and that everyone else is very different, and that's not the case. So first of all, there's that understanding, but also the evidence is there as well in the experiments that show that people do indeed spend this money on food. They spend it on entrepreneurship. They spend it on education. Everything that we ourselves think that we would like to spend it on, that's what it's observed in experiments that people spend it on. So another example is observed over and over again that people, let's say, choose to buy more fresh fruits and vegetables. Like, that's one of those things. And it's like, well, why aren't we doing that now? And well, a lot of it is that people can't afford to do these things. There's a lot of things that we would want to do that we can't afford to do that are good for us, and it's good for our society. And it's we're preventing people from doing that. And I also think that it's funny how we look at like money differently depending on like its origins. So let's say, people be like, oh, basic income, it's a bunch of people getting money for nothing. They didn't even work for it, and yet that same person will be like totally fine with say inheritance. And if you're a rich person and you're giving money to your kids, that's for nothing, then that's okay. So there's a difference here as far as like um, the the source and kind of our understanding of this when there's people get money earns money from interest, and there's stock dividends, and there's so many instances of income out there that's entirely disconnected from work, and we don't even ask those questions as to what are you going to spend it on. It's like how many people care that an inheritor of wealth might spend it on like lottery tickets or whatever drugs or alcohol or anything like that. It's so I think it's also kind of ridiculous that um, we decide that we should prevent people from spending money in certain ways that we don't wish for ourselves. I invite anyone to go to their boss and say, look, please don't pay me in cash anymore. Just pay for my rent and write me some like food vouchers that I could use, and pay me in like company script or something so that you can control what I buy. Like nobody thinks that.
But there is perhaps an issue from a strategic perspective here. I mean, to win the argument on universal basic income, presumably if a lot of people think that way, you have to get them to be a little less distrusting of others.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly part of the issue is a lack of trust. Um, and part of I think it's important for that is to ask the question, like, who do you trust more? Like, do you trust the government to say spend money for you, or do you trust yourself to spend money for you? Should the people be trusted and be empowered to make their own decisions, or is that like the role of government to make the decisions for them? And I think a lot of people who are okay, or at least superficially okay with making decisions for others, they also will say they do not want the government making decisions for them.
Okay, another criticism coming your way. Won't this cause massive inflation? If everyone gets $1,000 a month, won't that in effect become the new zero?
Yeah, so this goes back to what I was talking about when I talked about like the definition of basic income and how there's I think a misunderstanding by a lot of people who first hear about this concept that this is about creating more money to provide to everyone. And so if you think that, then it makes a lot more sense to think, well, if there's more and more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, then obviously the prices will go up. But again, that's not the way most plans are worked, because if they're funded by taxes, then you're not creating more money supply. It's just different people spending money for the same amounts of goods and services. And in which case, you don't see that same inflationary pressure. You can see inflationary pressures through money velocity. So that's like how quickly money is spent. And if you look at money velocity, it's actually incredibly low compared to, it actually looks like Great Depression levels kind of money velocity. There's like out of the total money in our money supply, really only a small fraction is being spent all that much, because also only a small fraction of people have the money to spend. So there's just not a lot of velocity going on at the bottom, and that's bad. You actually want more. But I think another key point in understanding of this inflationary argument is that competition still exists, and that's very important. As long as you have competitive markets, then let's say you're a store owner and everyone's going to get more money, so you're like, okay, I'm going to raise the price of milk from $4 a gallon to $8 a gallon. Well, all it takes is your competitor to say, I'm not going to raise my prices, or I might even put milk on sale. And then, of course, all of your customers could potentially go over there instead, and you'll go out of business. So there's actually a real life experiment in this every year in Alaska. And so what happens is all the store owners in Alaska know when that check is going out. So they know people have more money. What happens? Actually, there are dividend sales across Alaska. Like everyone actually lowers their prices because they're competing against each other in order to get that money. Like you don't want someone to spend their money somewhere else. You want them to spend it at your place. So that way, to attract that, you decrease prices. So that's an example of how more money could actually lead to lower prices through competition, and not these fears of rising prices. And in Alaska also shows a great example against this inflation argument too. If you look at the consumer price index in Alaska, so that for those who don't know, that is a measurement of inflation. And prior to 1982, the CPI of Alaska was actually growing at a faster rate than the rest of the United States. And after 1982, which was the first dividend payment, then the CPI of Alaska started growing at a slower rate than the rest of the US. So it was the opposite. Like if you had expected to see an increased CPI, and it actually slowed. So that's really interesting for everyone who thinks that this would lead to some kind of inflationary pressures. And then there's a lot of other variables too that I could get into, but instead I would just suggest that Google basic income inflation and Scott Santens, and you'll find my article that goes really in depth into this. But then I will just say one other thing, because I know people also concerned about rents as a specific rising cost. And when it comes to rent, there's a couple of really interesting things too about universal basic income. So on the first hand, we know that a lot of people rent because they can't afford to buy. And in the 70s experiments, when people perceived a guaranteed income, actually homeownership rates increased 26%. So, and that was surprising because this was a 5-year temporary income boost, and people were signing on to 30-year mortgages at a much increased rate. So we can expect even more from a UBI as far as homeownership rates go. And if you have a bunch more people actually buying instead of renting, then that means there's going to be less pressure on rents. It'll decrease that pressure. And the other thing too is that with basic income, you can live anywhere in the country. So it kind of introduces competition between high cost of living areas and low cost of living areas. If you're in a city, you basically have to stay there right now because that's where the employment is. You're kind of tied to that area. That's where the jobs are. But when you have a universal basic income, you effectively decouple people from these expensive cities, and they can actually choose to live elsewhere because they no longer have to live near cities in order to get an income. So that means that we should be able to see really like a renaissance as far as small town USA, because actually you could start up a business in a small town. It would be much cheaper to live there. Your money would go further, and everyone in that town would be customers because they would actually have money too. So that's another decrease of pressure on rents, whereas both those right now are pushing upwards on rents.
What about the following argument, which goes, I get where you're coming from, but why should people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates get a basic income? They're already ultra wealthy. They have loads of money. Isn't means testing more just and cost effective?
Yeah, it sounds like it makes sense that it would be more cheaper and cost effective, but really it isn't. So first of all, it's funny when people worry about, say, like Bill Gates receiving a basic income, because let's say if his taxes go up, $5 million or something to pay for his $12,000, then he is not a net recipient. He's paying a lot more in new taxes than he is to receive that $12,000. And then you wonder why, okay, so if it doesn't make any sense, if he's a net payer, then why even give him like the $12,000? And a fully universal program has a few important benefits besides this. So first of all, there's less bureaucracy. You're not having to calculate anything. You're not trying to figure out how much to give to people if they earned less or over some threshold amount. None of that. You're just saying, all right, everybody gets this money. Boom. That's extremely efficient. And as soon as you draw a line, now you have to test every single person to see if they're on one side of the line or the other. And that's an efficiency argument. But also there's a strength in the politics of it kind of argument, where, let's say, imagine if public education was means tested, so that Bill Gates actually was disallowed from utilizing the public school system. He actually had to use private schools to send kids to school, And what would be the effect of that? Like if we actually had a system where we said, hey, if you earn over six figures, then you're paying taxes for schools, but you don't get to use them. I think that would be actually very corrosive to public school system. It would not be as popular. One of the reasons why these fully universal programs are so popular is because they reach everyone, even those who don't use them. And there's also the rights argument to that too. Like, say, those who support universal health care, they would say, well, this is a human right. And I believe the same thing too is true about a basic income. You have the human right to these, your basic needs that you need for existence. And so, is it fair to say that Bill Gates is a different kind of person, that he doesn't have human rights because he's like too wealthy? Well, no. If we care about human rights, then they apply to everybody. And if we care about successful programs, they apply to everybody. And if you're paying taxes for a program, then you absolutely should have access to it and not be disallowed from it. That just makes sense too. And there's another element too, that's there's an argument to be made that dividing people into the deserving and undeserving is actually very corrosive to trust. And this is because of it creates the stigma, and you also have this problem with treating people who are just on either side of the line as entirely different people who are actually extremely similar. So imagine if you draw a line at $100,000 and you say those over it shouldn't get this. Well, let's say you have $100,001, and then you have someone who's at $99,999. So there's like $2 between them is the difference as far as this line goes. One person would receive this income and one person wouldn't. And what does that mean? Well, there's a really interesting trust experiment that shows that what happens is those who receive it, they actually their trust increases by, let's say, 1 point. So they're happy. They're happy that the government recognizes their need, and so they get a point. But then if you're on the other side of that line and you are in need, you feel you are in need, and you're not getting something from the government, and you see the people who right there in similar situations do, then now it's effectively a negative hit of 10 points. So you greatly lose trust because the government is treating you differently and is ignoring your need, your plight. So in this situation, I think that's one of the reasons why we've lost so much trust in government over the years, is because we are deciding to treat people differently, and we're leaving so many people out who we shouldn't be leaving out. It just makes far more sense to just make sure everybody gets this income, and then we worry about any clawback on the tax side of it. If Bill Gates doesn't need it because he's earning millions of dollars, then great. Then just tax it through the system so that he's a net payer. That's where it should be done. And it's just so much more efficient and so much more effective doing it that way.
Okay, Scott, final criticism that I've heard that I'll put your way, and then I promise the questions will get a bit nicer. So, what if people say, even if automation causes jobs to disappear in certain areas, does that make a universal basic income necessary? Won't that very technology also pave the way for new jobs that will replace the old jobs?
Yeah. So when you look at we will always create new jobs, but then it really matters to look at what is the rate of new job creation and how much these new jobs are paying, and also what are the conditions that these new jobs, what are the conditions that people work in for these new jobs, and we're already seeing this transformation of the labor market as we have for decades. And so, we have been eliminating jobs at the same time as creating new jobs. And for the most part, we've been creating actually fewer than we have been eliminating. That's already true. And at the same time, too, when people lose their jobs, like a small portion of them go on to, let's say, better jobs. They pay better, they reskill, and they're able to do these other jobs. That works out well for them. But for the most part, over the decades, people have actually been shifting over to the low skill end of the spectrum. And because those are the jobs that are being created, it's service industry jobs. And also this century, most of these jobs we've been creating are now in forms of alternative work. So that's part-time work, that's temporary labor, that's gig labor. So we're creating more and more jobs, and these jobs are actually lower skill, lower pay, worse hours, more insecure hours, fewer benefits, especially if you're like an Uber driver. You're no longer getting like unemployment insurance as part of this. You're not getting health care. So these jobs are worse over time. And as a result, people are living an increasingly precarious existence, even though they have jobs. It's just, how if you lose your $60,000 a year job and you get a new, $15,000 a year job, then the government will look at that and say, oh, look, automation is not a problem because there's been no difference in the employment rate. But of course, that's not true. You can't only look at the employment rate. There's so many more things involved to that. And the big result of what we've been seeing for decades is that people are just getting worse and worse jobs that are decreasingly able to provide them a secure existence, and that's a big problem.
Let me finish up by asking you about Andrew Yang. So obviously you're a big supporter of his. He's called you the leading thinker on universal basic income. He said he's learned so much from you. What are your, obviously he was unable to secure the Democratic nomination, but what are your reflections on how his campaign went now that all is said and done?
Yeah, I think that Andrew's campaign really helped shift the Overton window on universal basic income. And I know before he even started running, and we first sat down and he told me that he was thinking of doing this. And I remember at that time I was thinking, look, if you can even make it to the debates, then this will really boost the discussion, because now you would actually be talking about universal basic income in a at a political debate, a national level. So many people would hear about it for the first time. And you'd actually have to have the other candidates saying, whether they like it or whether they don't. And you'd actually have a real policy discussion around this idea that still before he ran, most people did not know about. And thanks to his running, so many more people know about what this idea is. So many more people support it, and also thankfully he did this at the time that he did, because here we are now at a pandemic, and countries have essentially shut down their economies. People are just unemployed at massive rates, and we're essentially seeing everything we talked about, what would happen with automation over the course of years, happening essentially all at once. When, what do you do? What is the proper response to mass unemployment? And thankfully, people really started to look more towards this basic income idea, because it was out there, it was fresh, people were just been talking about it, and it just makes sense. And so thankfully, the timing was such where countries around the world are really looking more at this right now. And even in the U.S., it's a different conversation than it would have been. I don't know if we would have as quickly, say, decided on stimulus payments as the course of action. I don't know if they would have decided to do an extra, $600 a week for the unemployed if we hadn't discussed this. It's interesting to wonder where we would be right now if we hadn't done that. But I think that we'd be worse off. And I think that because of his running, we're in a lot better position to actually, do what needs to be done, is actually providing people an income floor that they need, especially right now when they need it most.
And given the impact this pandemic is having on not just the US but the world, what do you think will be the consequence of not adopting a universal basic income in the US in the long term, I should say?
Yeah, no, I'm already, I've been worried. Um, we've already seeing things that are really worrisome, as far as, especially if you look at how things went in the last Great Recession. We know that suicides were a result of the last Great Recession. We know that domestic partner abuse and child abuse are results of this last Great Recession. We know that's what happens when people become unemployed. They live more stressful lives. And also I would say that the rioting that has just started, this is I think a connected to this. Like, if you have a population of people who are just barely getting by already, and then this hits, and now they're even worse off than before, and the government is not coming to their to their assistance as they should, what is there to do? As they say, writing is the language of the unheard, and I think we're starting to see that, and it worries me, how much more of this we're going to see, and across the world, depending on what countries do, if there's like a second peak, all these things. There were already 600,000 deaths of despair in the U.S. That people have lost their lives because of this, increasing insecurity, loss of income. People turn to drinking, people turn to opiates, and they either commit suicide on purpose, or these deaths are a result of this, where it's essentially an accidental suicide. It's considered to be a death of despair. And we can imagine there's going to be a lot more of those if we don't end this drastic economic insecurity. And it's troubling to see some of these figures too, where we're looking at potentially 42% of all the jobs that have been eliminated being permanently gone. Like, they're not coming back. And people who think that we're just going to flip back on the economy, no way that's going to happen, for multiple reasons. So first of all, there's a pandemic, so that's changed people's behaviors. And just because, let's say, you open up a restaurant, if there's no vaccine, are you just going to go back to that restaurant? Are you just going to, even if you can? I talked to someone the other day who there's like a neighboring community here that's outside of New Orleans that has like different laws as far as reopening, and it's a lot more open than it is here in New Orleans. And you go there, and it's like you can be the only person in this restaurant. Just that's it. And so there's a couple reasons potentially for that. One is that people are worried about their health. So do they not want to go back, even if they have money, because there's no vaccine yet? So they're just going to not spend that money? That's possible. Another part of it too is maybe they don't have that money. Maybe they became unemployed and maybe they didn't qualify for any of the employment assistance because of the conditions involved. Maybe they were working in some job where they're not able to sufficiently prove that they lost, unemployment or whatever. When anyway, they're not covered by this. So there's no money. And so you can't spend money to the economy if you don't have any. And that's going to be, it's a big problem we have to overcome right now, is not only this change in behavior, but the fact that so many people lost incomes and also the insecurity of it. So let's say you have money, let's say you still have a job. Maybe you're feeling a little bit, unsafe. You're like, let's put the money away. Let's save that money instead of spending it because we don't know what's going to happen. So as long as this unknown exists, and there's going to be less spending into the economy. So as people spend less, then you're looking at a Great Depression scenario as this deflation sets in, and just the cycle builds worse and worse and worse as people, companies shut down because they don't have people spending at them, and then their employees lose money, and therefore they can't spend more, and so it's this downward spiral. The only way to really get out of this downward spiral is to make sure that people have money to spend. And if you're really smart about it, you're going to make sure that people have more money to spend than usual, because we actually need to stimulate our way out of this. And so that's why I think it's so important even right now to do an even higher UBI than I would usually recommend under normal circumstances. So I say, like in the US, we should be doing $2,000 every month of basic income to every adult and $1,000 for every kid. I think that would be sufficient to boost us out of this and prevent a depression scenario.
Scott, thanks ever so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Sam.